You know, usually when we think about massive society-altering change, whether it's a new fashion trend taking over the globe or a political movement or even a dramatic shift in crime rates, we operate with this fundamental expectation of steady progression.
Right, like it's supposed to make logical sense.
Exactly. We're all gradualists at heart, you know?
Right.
We think that if you want a massive shift in society, you need a correspondingly massive, slow-building push over a long period of time.
It's incredibly comforting to think the world works like that, like a simple, balanced math equation.
Yeah.
You add a little effort, you get a little change.
Yeah.
You invest millions of dollars in decades of social reform, you get a big societal shift. The effect is supposed to be directly proportional to the cause.
But then you encounter these strange historical moments where that equation it completely shatters, where a tiny, almost invisible shift creates a global phenomenon practically overnight. So today we are going to dive into the hidden architecture of these sudden societal changes. We're pulling from some really brilliant insights in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point.
It's such a fascinating read because he frames it not just as history, but as a completely different way to look at how we influence each other.
Because ideas and products and behaviors, they don't just spread like rumors, they spread exactly like biological viruses. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to prove that social trends act like literal infections, we don't even have to start with abstract theory. We just have to look at brushed suede shoes and inner city crime.
Which I know seem entirely unrelated.
Right.
But they perfectly illustrate this shattered equation you're talking about. Let's look at the shoes first. Hush Puppies.
Oh man, yeah.
By late 1994, this brand was essentially on life support. They were selling maybe 30,000 pairs a year.
Which in the footwear industry
It's basically a rounding error.
Yeah.
They were tucked away in these small-town family stores, and the parent company, Wolverine, was actively considering just shutting the whole line down.
They were officially dead. But then, a handful of kids in the East Village and Soho in Manhattan started buying them up at thrift stores. And the crucial detail here is why they were wearing them.
Right, it wasn't a genuine fashion statement.
No, they weren't trying to start a mainstream trend. They were wearing them precisely because the shoes were so uncool. It was completely ironic.
But that ironic behavior suddenly became visible to the right people. High fashion designers like Isaac Mizrahi and John Bartlett happened to be hanging around downtown. They saw these kids, thought the look was interesting, and decided to put Hush Puppies on their runway models just as an incidental, quirky touch.
Right.
And then, the actor Pee Wee Herman walks into a Hollywood boutique that has a giant inflatable basset hound on the roof, and he asks for a couple of pairs.
And the resulting numbers are just staggering. By 1995, they go from selling almost nothing to 430,000 pairs. The next year, it's 4 times that amount. They actually win the prize for Best Accessory at the Council of Fashion Designers Awards. The president of Wolverine is standing on stage with Calvin Klein, accepting an award for a massive global trend he literally had zero hand in creating.
That's incredible.
The trend didn't build, it tipped.
Now compare that bizarre fashion story to something infinitely more serious, which is violent crime in New York City.
Yeah.
In the early 1990s, neighborhoods like Brownsville and East New York were experiencing devastating levels of violence. Police radios at sundown sounded like active combat zones. In 1992, there were over 2,000 murders in the city.
It was a crisis.
But then, a few years later, the numbers didn't just slowly decline. Within a 5-year window, murders dropped by an astonishing 64.3%.
And when you look back at that, the conventional wisdom always jumps to those big proportional causes we talked about earlier. We assume the crime drop must have been caused by massive structural changes.
Right, we want a big explanation for a big change.
Exactly. We say, oh, well, policing strategies vastly improved, or the crack trade naturally aged out, or the national economy got better, so people had more jobs and less desperation.
But what's fascinating here is that when criminologists actually dig into those conventional explanations, they simply do not account for the sheer suddenness of the drug.
No, they don't.
The economy improving is a long-term, slow-moving trend. Demographic shifts take a generation. Improved policing takes years to train and implement. None of that explains why crime in New York didn't just slowly ebb, but plummeted like a stone off a cliff in such a condensed time frame.
And this brings up the paper folding analogy, which completely changed how I look at causality.
Oh, I love this one.
So if I hand you a large piece of paper right now and ask you to fold it in half over itself 50 times, how thick do you think it gets? Our gradualist brains guess maybe the thickness of a phone book. If we're feeling really adventurous, maybe the height of a refrigerator.
Right.
But the actual mathematical answer, if you fold a piece of paper 50 times, it reaches the sun.
It's wild.
It is. It's a geometric progression. The end result is completely absurdly out of proportion to the cause.
And that math is the perfect way to visualize this. It illustrates the three distinct traits of any epidemic, whether you're looking at a fashion trend, a crime wave, or a literal respiratory virus.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, contagiousness. We understand this intuitively. I mean, even reading the word yawn can make you yawn.
True.
Second, little causes have massive effects, like your paper folding analogy. And third, change happens in one dramatic moment. Think of a rainstorm. The temperature drops from 34 degrees to 31 degrees. It's a tiny incremental 3-degree drop.
Almost nothing has changed.
Right, almost nothing has changed in the environment, yet suddenly, rain radically transforms into a completely different physical substance.
Wow.
Snow. That exact moment of phase transition is the tipping point.
Okay, so we know that things can tip suddenly, and we know from the paper folding that it only takes a tiny push to get massive results. But what exactly are the levers we're pushing?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. To figure this out, we have to look at a real-world medical puzzle that played out in the mid-90s. And it honestly reads like a detective novel. Between 1995 and 1996, the city of Baltimore saw a horrific 500% increase in children born with syphilis.
500%.
Yeah. If you look at the graph, it doesn't slope upward, it just shoots up at a sharp right angle.
You have three brilliant experts looking at the exact same data, attempting to explain this sudden geometric explosion.
Yeah.
But they come up with three totally different culprits.
Okay, who was first?
First, the CDC weighed in. They argued that the tipping point was a subtle increase in crack cocaine usage in the city. The theory was that crack altered the physical environment of poor neighborhoods, increasing prostitution and risky behavior, which acted as an accelerant for the disease.
Okay, makes sense. But then you have John Zenelman, a clinical researcher from Johns Hopkins, and he completely ignores the drugs and looks at the city's bureaucracy. He points out that right before the spike, Baltimore cut the budget for its STD clinics. The number of clinicians dropped from 17 to 10. Patient visits dropped from 36,000 to 21,000.
And we really need to understand the mechanism of why that matters. A disease like syphilis is normally treated quickly with penicillin. It's an acute infection.
Yeah, you get the shot and you're good.
Right. But because of the budget cuts, people couldn't get appointments. They were walking around infectious for weeks instead of days. If you were contagious for 3 days, you might expose one person. If you're contagious for 30 days, you might expose a dozen people. The budget cut structurally changed the timeline of the infectious agent itself.
So that's the second theory. Then finally, you have John Potterat, a leading epidemiologist. He doesn't look at drugs or budget cuts. He looks at the city's architecture.
The physical buildings.
Yes. He points out that Baltimore dynamically demolished massive 1960s public housing projects like Lexington Terrace and Lafayette Courts. This demolition took a highly concentrated, infected population and scattered them into entirely new neighborhoods, spreading the web of the disease to areas that had never seen it before.
Right.
So what does this all mean? Because I have to push back here. Look, if my car breaks down, it's either the battery, the alternator, or the starter. It's not all three. How can three highly credentialed experts look at the exact same graph and blame three completely different things? They can't all be the sole reason for one epidemic.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we realize they aren't actually contradicting each other at all.
Really?
No, they're describing the three distinct universal levers that can tip any epidemic. They were just pulling different levers.
Yeah.
The CDC, by pointing to how crack changed the neighborhood dynamics, is describing the power of context. Zenelman, by showing how the disease lingered longer in the body, is describing the stickiness factor. And Potterat, by tracking how specific infected individuals moved to new areas, is describing the law of the few.
Let's actually dig into that first one, the power of context, because the mechanics of it are mind-blowing. Zenelman had this massive medical map of Baltimore with black stars pinned for every single syphilis case.
I love this visual.
During the summer, you can see the stars radiating out along the highways. But in the winter, when it gets cold and people stay indoors, the stars fade. The disease literally stops moving simply because the physical temperature changed.
It proves that human behavior is profoundly sensitive to our immediate physical and social circumstances. Far more than we like to admit, actually.
Oh, definitely.
We like to think our actions are driven by deep-seated personality traits, but often they are driven by the context of the room we are standing in. And this perfectly frames one of the most misunderstood psychological phenomena of the 20th century.
The tragic murder of Kitty Genovese in New York in 1964. This one fundamentally changed how I view human nature, because we've all heard the traditional story. She was attacked outside her apartment over the course of half an hour. 38 neighbors supposedly watched from their windows, heard her screaming, and not a single person picked up the phone to call the police.
Right.
For decades, this has been taught in sociology classes as the ultimate proof of urban apathy. The narrative is that the big city makes people cold, dehumanized, and entirely selfish.
But two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, they weren't satisfied with that moralistic explanation.
Oh.
They didn't think 38 people just suddenly lost their humanity. So they staged a series of emergency experiments to see what actually dictates whether someone will step up and help a stranger. In one scenario, they had an actor stage a severe epileptic fit down a hallway.
Okay.
If a test subject thought they were the only person who could hear the seizure, they rushed out to help 85% of the time. But if the subject thought there were 4 other people listening in different rooms, they helped only 31% of the time.
And they proved it wasn't just a fluke. They did it with the smoke-filled room experiment, too. If someone is filling out a questionnaire alone and smoke starts pouring under the door, 75% report it immediately. If they're in a group, only 38% report it.
It's the bystander effect.
And this was the massive aha moment for me. We've been judging those 38 neighbors for decades, calling them monsters. But the agonizing irony is nobody called the police because 38 people heard her scream. Everyone assumed someone else was handling it.
Exactly.
If Kitty Genovese had been attacked on a lonely street with just one single witness looking out a window, she almost certainly would have lived because the responsibility wouldn't have been diffused across a crowd.
That is the raw power of context. Tweaking the environment, even something as simple as the number of people in a room, completely overrides our core, deeply held personality traits. We act entirely differently depending on the context.
Okay, but let me challenge that for a second. Let's say the environment is perfectly primed, the context is right. But what if the idea or the product you're trying to spread is just boring? Does an epidemic still tip just because the context is good?
It absolutely does not. And that is why the second lever is so crucial, which is the stickiness factor.
Yeah.
You can have the perfect environment, but if the message goes in one ear and out the other, the epidemic dies. A message or a virus has to make a lasting impact. It has to stick.
Right. And a great example of this is Winston cigarettes in the 1950s. They launched a massive campaign with the slogan, "Winston tastes good like a cigarette should." Now, grammatically, that is completely incorrect. The copywriters knew it should have been as a cigarette should.
Right.
But that tiny syntactic error created mental friction. It was provocative. People complained about it, which meant they were talking about it. It got stuck in people's heads. It was an incredibly sticky message that rocketed them to the top of the market.
And biological viruses do the exact same thing when they're trying to gain a foothold. Look at the research of Dutch AIDS researcher Jaap Goudsmit. He found evidence of a very early HIV epidemic in the 1950s in a Dutch training hospital in Heerlen, specifically in a ward known as the Swedish Barrack.
Okay.
Over 3 years, 81 infants contracted what we now know was HIV through unsterilized glass needles. But here is the critical part. Only a third of those infants died.
Which is incredibly hard to wrap your head around today, knowing how devastating HIV became. How did they survive it?
Well, the infants' immune systems were largely able to fight off the virus. Why? Because while the virus was contagious, it was spreading from bed to bed, it wasn't yet sticky.
Oh, wow.
Right? It didn't have the structural integrity to hold on inside the host. The global epidemic didn't tip in the 1950s. It tipped in the 1980s because the virus itself mutated over those decades. It changed structurally to become deadlier. Once it infected a host, it stayed, it stuck. So whether you are dealing with a catchy marketing slogan or a deadly pathogen, if it is easily defeated or easily forgotten, you simply don't have an epidemic.
So we need a primed environment, and we need a sticky, unforgettable message. But ideas and viruses don't just magically float from person to person. Someone actually has to do the spreading. Which brings us to the final lever, the law of the few. This rule states that in any epidemic, a tiny, almost microscopic percentage of the population does the vast majority of the work.
It's an extreme version of the 80-20 principle. Let's go back to epidemiology for a second. Take the gonorrhea epidemic in Colorado Springs. This was a city of over 100,000 people. Potteratt, the same epidemiologist from the Baltimore story, traced the entire city's epidemic back to just 168 highly active individuals.
That's it, 168 people.
That's it. Those 168 people hanging out in basically 6 local bars were the engine for the entire city's infection rate.
And these carriers aren't acting like the rest of us. They are super spreaders. I mean, the sources mention guys like Bossman McGee in East St. Louis, who reportedly slept with over 100 women in 2 years and infected at least 30 with HIV.
Yeah.
Or New Shauna Williams in upstate New York, who maintained multiple apartments, juggled dozens of partners, and infected at least 16 teenage girls. These are biological carriers with an exceptional tragic capacity to spread disease far beyond normal human behavior. But what blew my mind is that the exact same super spreader dynamic applies to social epidemics.
Right. And this raises an important question, which is, who are the social equivalents of these super spreaders? To find out, let's look at the start of the American Revolution.
Let's do it.
April 18th, 1775. Paul Revere does his famous midnight ride from Boston to Lexington to warn the colonial militia that the British are coming. The word spreads like wildfire, reaching towns 40 miles away by morning. It was an incredibly successful social epidemic. But what history often forgets is that another man, a fellow revolutionary named William Dawes, rode out that exact same night. He carried the exact same sticky message, traveling through just as many towns on a slightly different route.
But nobody remembers William Dawes. There are no famous poems about him. He rode through towns like Waltham, and the local leaders didn't mobilize. They didn't ring the church bells. They didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late.
Crazy.
Same message, same night, totally different result. Why? Because Paul Revere possessed a very specific social gift. He was what sociologists call a connector.
And to really understand how connectors operate, we have to look at a fascinating, slightly chaotic experiment from the late 1960s by the psychologist Stanley Milgram. He wanted to test how connected human beings really are.
Yeah.
So he gave a packet to 160 random people in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay.
The goal was to get this packet to a specific stockbroker in Boston. But the rule was, you couldn't just mail it to him. You could only send it to a personal friend, someone you knew on a first-name basis, who you thought might be socially closer to the target.
And amazingly, it worked. The packets reached the Boston stockbroker in an average of 5 or 6 steps, which, by the way, is exactly where popular culture gets the phrase 6 degrees of separation.
Yes. But here is the critical detail everyone misses about Milgram's experiment. When Milgram looked at the final step, the people who actually walked up and handed the packet to the stockbroker, he found that half of all the successful letters were delivered by just 3 men.
Wait, really? Out of all those people?
Half of them. 3 guys named Jacobs, Jones, and Brown. The 6 degrees of separation doesn't mean that every single person is equally linked to every other person. It means the vast majority of us are linked to the broader world through a tiny handful of highly connected individuals.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about your own 40 closest friends right now. Trace backward how you originally met them. You'll likely find that your social circle is not actually a circle, it's a pyramid. When I did this, I realized that a massive chunk of my own friendships stem from just 1 or 2 highly gregarious people who invited me into their world years ago. They hold the keys to the entire network.
And we can actually measure this social phenomenon. The text describes a simple test where you read through a list of 250 random surnames taken from a Manhattan phone book, and you just count how many people you know with those names. A typical college student averages about 21. A highly educated professional might average about 41, but a true connector, a man named Roger Horchow, scored a 98.
Horchow is a legendary Broadway producer, and his story is incredible. He literally secured the Broadway rights to a George Gershwin musical just by playing an insane game of social connect the dots.
Oh yeah, tell this one.
He had a friend whose sister used to date George Gershwin, which somehow led him to a casual lunch with Gershwin's nephew, which led him to casually mention he knew a cookbook author in Dallas who happened to be married to George Gershwin's closest childhood friend. Boom, he gets the rights.
It's amazing.
But wait, I have to ask, doesn't that just sound like ruthless networking? Are connectors just the people at parties aggressively collecting business cards?
Not at all. That's a really common misconception. Connectors don't network for transactional gain. They have an innate curiosity about people and a boundless energy for maintaining what sociologists call weak ties.
Weak ties.
Right. Most of us have limited social energy. We reserve it for deep, strong ties with close friends. But strong ties usually know the same things we do. They run in the same circles. Connectors find genuine joy in the casual acquaintance. They remember your birthday. They remember where you went to middle school. Because they maintain these weak ties, they naturally occupy dozens of different subcultures and worlds, acting as the bridge between them.
It's exactly like the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Computer scientists actually mapped Hollywood and figured out the average actor connects to Kevin Bacon in 2.83 steps. Why? Because Kevin Bacon, like a true connector, hasn't just starred in blockbusters. He's done indie films, horror, drama, comedy. He has worked across so many different genres and niches that he has become the linchpin of the entire industry.
So, to synthesize all of this, whether you are looking at the sudden resurgence of an ironic shoe brand, a miraculous drop in violent crime, the tragic spread of a disease, or the midnight ride of Paul Revere, the underlying mechanics are identical. You need the law of the few.
Right.
Those energetic connectors to spread the word across different subcultures.
Right.
You need the stickiness factor, a message or a product packaged in a way that creates mental friction and is impossible to forget. And you need the power of context, a physical or social environment perfectly primed for that specific behavior to take root.
It completely reframes how you look at your daily life, doesn't it? We always assume that to create big change, we need massive resources, millions of dollars in advertising, or a total societal overhaul. But the truth is much more hopeful. Change is an epidemic. It's driven by that geometric progression of the paper folding.
And understanding the geometry is incredibly empowering. It means that minor alterations, carefully conceived and adeptly enacted, can produce major consequences. You don't have to boil the ocean. You just have to find the right connector, craft the right sticky message, and tweak the immediate context.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to take with you today. We've spent this whole deep dive looking at how these 3 rules create positive or neutral epidemics, how a trend catches fire, or how a warning spreads to start a revolution. But what if you reverse engineered this?
Oh, that's a fascinating application.
Right. Imagine you are facing a negative epidemic in your own life right now. Maybe it's a toxic rumor sweeping through your workplace, or really bad habits spreading in your household. How could you use these exact same 3 levers to deliberately stop a tipping point before it ever happens? Can you isolate the connector who is spreading the rumor? Can you unstick the message by changing the narrative so it's less provocative? Or can you subtly alter the physical context of your office or home to diffuse the tension? Because remember, if you understand the precise moment when rain turns to snow, you don't just have to watch the weather happen. You can start controlling the thermostat.